Okay, there's still a few people trickling in, but we have surpassed our goal of 100 participants. So we will just start with whoever is here. Welcome to this BrokeX Spring Seminar Series. My name is Heidi Østbø Haugen. I'm a human geographer and a professor of China Studies at the University of Oslo. So BrokeX is the short name for the project Brokering China's Extraversion and Ethnographic Analysis of Transnational Arbitration. With me in BrokeX, I have a group of postdocs and PhD scholars from the fields of urban planning, economic history, and political science. And we were all set to go for 9 months for fieldwork and archival work in South China in 2020, which is suspended. But we do have one of our PhD scholars doing ethnographic fieldwork now in Shenzhen, actually, where she's working in startups and incubators. And for me, her accounts from the ground is really a weekly highlight that keeps my enthusiasm up for this project. When I planned the BrokeX seminars, I always knew that Shenzhen would be the topic of the first session, which in part has something to do with the city's legacy and role in China's path towards opening up to the world. But I think it's as interesting that Shenzhen is seen as this symbol of many things, to the extent that we often forget that it's an actual place where lives are lived. So, say urban studies colleagues tell me that, oh, I showed that time-lapse video from Shenzhen when urban land is taking over agricultural land that many of you have probably seen. But then they don't include any readings on the city. Or international relations scholars say, oh, Shenzhen, it's where China's economic reforms were initiated. But often they don't seem that interested or curious about what happened after that. And even within China, I was a bit surprised that with the 40th anniversary of the special economic zones in Shenzhen, the celebration was passing without that much commotion, although Shenzhen in South China's Greater Bay Area is really changed. Its role has really changed, and its relations with the world are really changing in some major ways right now at the moment. For anyone who's interested in what's going on the ground in Shenzhen and the city's urban transformations, I can hardly think of any better source than Du Juan's work. And the other speaker here, Kien Van Lim, is a person that I've enjoyed discussing geographic restructurings in China, South China with for a period of several years. And both of them will be introduced properly by my colleague Siv Oftedal. Before I give the word to her, I need to thank her and Christian Sløgedal and Ichi Zhang for assisting me in organizing this series. And a shout out also to the graphic designer, Catherine Gill. Finally, I must thank the European Research Council for funding BrokeX and for not being afraid to put money into truly interdisciplinary and empirically rich research. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi, for introducing the seminar series and the project that the series of seminars belongs to. My name is Siv Oftedal, and I'm a researcher on this project at the University of Oslo, and I will host today's seminar. So today we are going to hear first two presentations about Shenzhen, the southern city of Shenzhen that just turned 40 as a special economic zone in 2020, from two prominent experts who have both published books on the topic, Dr. Duan Du and Dr. Kien Van Lim. But before we start, though, I want to give a little bit of practical information about this seminar. Our viewers on Zoom are very welcome to ask questions to our two guests today. Please do so by using the chat function. You can send to the host that's called questions. That's the default host. And if you do this, these questions can only be seen by the host. These questions will be collected and I will read some of them to our presenters towards the end of the session. So I'm afraid we will not be able to cover all of these questions that we receive in the chat. So it will be very helpful if you keep your question fairly short, and we will always also be grateful if you put your name and either your institution or your country on top of your question. In that way, we can try to make our choice of questions as diverse as possible. Since we are recording this session, please make a note at the beginning of your question if you do not wish to be identified by name, which is okay when you ask questions. Okay, that being said, first we will hear from Dr. Duyen Do from the University of Hong Kong, where she is Associate Dean and also Director of the Urban Ecologies Design Lab. She has recently been announced the next Dean of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Architecture, which is very exciting. Her research and design work has been widely published and exhibited, and she has previously taught at MIT and Peking University. And generally in her work, she focuses on the relationship between formal planning and policies on the one hand, with the informal, spontaneous growth of architecture and urbanism on the other hand, which is very relevant for the topic of Shenzhen City. And she has recently published a book called Shenzhen Experiment, the story of China's instant city, which she will talk more about today. So with that, I give the word to Duyen Do.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Siv, for that introduction, and thank you to Heidi and the University of Oslo and this particular really fascinating research project for inviting me to share and have this discussion with you all and with King. I look forward to his presentation as well. So as Siv has introduced, I just recently published my book on Shenzhen, in which it took me just 15 years. So it's very much a labor of, at this point I'm not sure what it is. If it's more labor of love or labor of hate, it was labor. And the title is called The Shenzhen Experiment, the story of China's instant city. But if I had my way and not the publishers, it would be called Demystifying the Instant City Development Model, Shenzhen as a Critical Experiment. But that might turn a lot of people off, so I was told. So so here I am, glad to have this audience of China scholars and social scientists and other students and researchers interested in this issue. So this is the inside cover of my book, The Shenzhen Experiment. For those of you who haven't seen the book or haven't looked further beyond the tens of thousands of news articles that somehow quote Shenzhen all the time, as Heidi was mentioning, as really as an image of China's modernity, or as sort of this very instantaneous urban development, you may be surprised why there is such a painting. This is from the 16th century. It's the Qing Dynasty depiction of the exact same spot that is Shenzhen today. And I'll get to that a little bit more of why this was on the inside cover of this book on Shenzhen, since the city is only 40 years old, hence the title of this this panel, I guess, the Shenzhen at 40, right? The 40 is 40 years old. And I would contest to say that Shenzhen's centuries of history is as important as its 40 years history. So my book is organized broadly in 8 chapters, and each chapter, the layers goes through from national relevance to regional history, city construction, and finally district transformation. So each part is a further zooming in, if you will, a more on the ground from an overall understanding and cultural understanding, and to then the urban fabric of the city. The first chapter, however, I thought would be relevant for this discussion, since I see that Heidi has put it as the story of spring, right? Chinese 春天的故事. So I would like to share with everyone here a very short clip of the original music video that is the story of spring, this song. And in my book, I called it really the people's anthem of reform. It was a very, very popular song. I was I was 11 when I moved from China to the US in the 80s, and everybody really knew the song to heart, and it was something that was really important, I think, for the spirit at the time. And what I want to also call out to your attention to is whether you can read Chinese or hear Chinese or understand Chinese, maybe you can, if you cannot, maybe also pay attention to the imagery. This was one of China's first ever music video made. And it was made on location with a very, very low budget in Shenzhen, and it was Shenzhen in the early 90s. So the background you'll see, eventually there will be urban scenes where the singer Dong Wenhua is walking through the city. I mean, I really consider this actually very valuable documentary footage, as well as, you know, a cultural artifact of China's very early pop, folk, patriotic music. 1979年，那是一个春天，有一位老人在中国的南海边画了一个圈。什么的崛起，多短暂。 奇迹般的足迹，刻在金山。我没有关系，两岸美湾，我也看到了那江流。So as you can see that in the music video, by the way, the graininess of the video is not my computer. It's just really a very early, you know, this is when China just opened up and just started experimenting with mass media and in music videos. So the original production was quite low res, but you can see that the imagery, there's the imagery of a coastal city. There's imagery of a very urban scene that is in the middle of construction. And then there's intersected imagery of, as you can see, Forbidden City in Beijing. So this song and the imagery really became, you know, itself became a myth maker. It very much contributed to the myth that Shenzhen would become. And it cemented both, you know, Deng Xiaoping's role in Shenzhen, Shenzhen's importance in the popular imagination of people in China. You know, you would have millions of people who had never been to Shenzhen, but they've heard of the song, they've seen the music video, and it's in their mind, this is the representation of new China, modern China, and post-reform China. So, you know, as I mentioned, that I called it very much that the song was in itself a myth maker, and you know, and it celebrated very much Deng Xiaoping, and I would say that Deng Xiaoping himself was also a myth maker. For those of you who are students of Deng Xiaoping and the opening reform, you might know that he constantly also utilized imagery of Shenzhen or Shenzhen speed to really, in some ways, achieve his purpose of trying to galvanize a nation to try to experiment with something, else that China at the time, right, in 1970s, this is late 1970s, that China was not. You know, it was very much a planned economy. There was very strict limitations on migration, on work permits, on you know, hukou and etc. So, you know, for him, for Deng Xiaoping, I believe that he very much also utilized Shenzhen as an image of an instant success, to try to really convince whether it's his fellow policymakers in Beijing or, you know, everyday people in China to really buy into this particular important, for him at the time, the goal of China's reform and opening. So here I would like to very quickly introduce what I think are 4 standing misconceptions about that myth of Shenzhen that gets repeated constantly over and over again by practically every single mass media and sometimes scholarly writings on Shenzhen. And that is the misconceptions of purpose, time, people, and place. The misconception of purpose, right, the SEZ, Special Economic Zone, there is this misconception that the Special Economic Zone of China, especially of Shenzhen, today when we look back and say it's been such a spectacular economic success, so the SEZ, the Special Economic Zone, really achieved its purpose to generate enormous wealth and enormous economy that's able to lift China to where it is today, one of the greatest kind of global economic powers. And my argument is that that's misconception, because in the 1970s, when the special economic zones were being launched and tested, China was in deep poverty. The purpose of the special economic zone was not for China to become a global economic power. It was simply so that the people in the country could have a basic healthy life that allows one to enjoy life and not to have to experience the trauma of mass starvation. This is in 1970, China just came out of the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and before that, the Great Leap Forward, before that, the Great Famine. So it was a series of tragic events that has led them to really, I think, really as an act of last resort to say, we need to do something. We need to try to do something to see how can we do better. And I believe that is a very important difference of saying, let's see how can we give people better lives versus let's see how can we just generate enormous wealth for the country. These are very different purposes. This is a photograph, early photograph in 1950s, 60s of the border between Shenzhen and Hong Kong. And what you see is this river. Thousands of people have died crossing that river, whether from drowning or from military actions. And part of the reason why Shenzhen was cited where it is, is because it bordered Hong Kong and the river is here. So it was a rural blind county that then in 1979, 41 years ago, 1979, first was designated as the city of Shenzhen. So only the year after, in 1980, the part that's adjacent to the border of Hong Kong became designated as the special economic zone of the city of Shenzhen. And that really became this buffer zone. That was the first buffer zone experimentation of say, can we try to see, can we do something here different? Let's see, could China experiment with a different model, with market reform and with other, I would argue, social cultural reforms as well as economic reforms. And one thing I want to add in here is that there is a misconception that Shenzhen Special Economic Zone was created solely as an economic zone, which many cities and countries today are modeling after, their export processing zones, production zones, etc. But I want to say something that this is Shenzhen's master plan in 1982. And it's very much, there's living areas and there's forestry areas and there's factory areas. But within 3 years of that, this is the master plan drafted in 1985, it was already a master plan for a comprehensive city, with culture, with leisure, with education, with parks, commercial centers, and etc. It really, from the very beginning of even Shenzhen's urban planning during the first 5 years, and this is thanks to the mayor of 1985, who really said we cannot only be an economic zone, it has to be a comprehensive city. It has to be where people enjoy to live and to work. And so all of these things, I think, really, I hope, we can try to clarify a little bit more the purpose behind, the original purpose behind the political agenda of special economic zone, and then how the term economic zone in some ways have masked the fact that Shenzhen from the very beginning really had this ideal ambition to be a comprehensive city for people to live in, and not only just one for economic production. Misconception time. Is it really 40 years? I showed this image very quickly as the inside cover of my book. And I want to say that, for one of the exhibitions I did, this is kind of the very long timeline of the written recorded history of the location that would become Shenzhen. And 1979 is somewhere here. Can you see my cursor? Siv, can you see my cursor? Give me an okay, right. 1979 is here. We start, a few centuries BC. Where there was already recorded history of culture and production and military and governance. So, and there were written records and historic maps and cartographies throughout. And this is an example of one location. This is Nantou Historic City. Its first settlement was actually 100 BC. And today, you could still see Nantou Historic City in Shenzhen. If you go to Shenzhen, you ask where's Nantou Historic City, you can go, you can visit. The site is actually still there. The street pattern still follows actually a late Ming, early Qing dynasty street pattern. The history of the city and pockets of it very much transcends, and it's very much a continuous history. And that really, for me, is very important to demystify this myth of Shenzhen being an instant city out of blank, that there was nothing really important there, including a very, very often misquoted number. It was only a small fishing village of 30,000 people. First of all, I don't know that many small fishing villages that has 30,000 people. Second of all, Shenzhen Old Market Town in 1979 had 30,000 people. That's just the spot right here. The entire Shenzhen had 300,000 people. And those 300,000 people actually were distributed over 2,000 villages and towns and kind of commercial, industrial, urban settlements. It was not only one of a fishery or even agriculture, that there were centuries of active trade and even international, transnational trade. And these villages and townships carried its relationship throughout centuries, and it formulated a very close relationship with the entire South China Sea, all the neighboring countries. All of that was very important to lead to kind of post-1979 construction of particular urban fabric. This is an urban village. This is not planned by the city. It was not built by the city. It was built, self-built by the original villagers. That these villages, again, have been in the site for over centuries. So when it became urbanized, the villages themselves built particular housing. In addition to those 300,000 villagers distributed over 2,000 villages, there were also people coming from all over China. In this case, this is the Army's infrastructure corps. They were sent to Shenzhen really as the first infrastructure soldiers, and they had experience of constructing roads and highways and tall buildings and dams from all over China, and they very much contributed to it. You also had leaders and politicians and very ambitious and idealistic, well-educated, whether entrepreneurs or educators or politicians coming from all over China going to the city. So it's very much a collector from the very beginning of a very dynamic group of people. This wasn't a population one should easily discount. Finally, misconception of place. This myth of that it was a small sleeping fishing village. I hope I don't have to reiterate, it was simply not true. But not only was it not true about that village, is that in addition to the human settlements of the villages and townships, which you can see here in the dark areas, there were, everything you see blue in this map that I made were farming fields. So there were aggregated rice fields, and in green were cultivated forestries and orchards. So it was very much a productive landscape. It was one that was very, very much part of a production of both kind of commerce and agriculture and aquaculture. So all of that means is that Shenzhen, as it developing to a city today, very much have continued and was built upon the foundations of all of these pre-existing geographies, whether they were natural, cultural, or man-made. So, you know, in Shenzhen today, you have the original villagers who are still there. You have the migrant populations and their children who live in very often in the urban villages, settlements, because that's where the most affordable housing could be found. You have tech workers. You know, a lot had been made about Shenzhen in the past 5 years being the city of the future, high tech industries, etc. When those highly educated, ambitious tech workers arrive in Shenzhen, they also live in the urban villages. They live where there's affordable housing. Shenzhen today is a city of 20 million. 10 million people still live in these urban villages. De facto 10 million people, half of the city's population of this future city lives in the historic village sites that has been passed through generations, centuries, in some cases, you could say over a millennium. So Shenzhen, of course, is also this. There's no denying that Shenzhen, you know, especially as an architect, I'm not trying to say that Shenzhen's only of urban villages and historic sites, but I'm trying to say that one only start to understand the city of Shenzhen as a place with all of the diverse groups of people by understanding its total history and its various ecologies of people and landscapes and histories. And for me, that's very important for, I think, the theme, I believe, of this talk series of looking at China and where it came from and where is it going and what's its global role. Because with the common misconceptions of Shenzhen, common misconception of Shenzhen's purpose, time, people, and place, it can be very easy to say Shenzhen's success is because of authoritarian governance. That there's a cultural disruption because everything is new, that it's very much, you know, it's exclusive community because it is a high-tech future city, that is top-down planning because it's master planned, controlled economy, and that there is a rural-urban divide, that everything's urbanized. And I will argue that a more nuanced understanding of the history of Shenzhen and re-examine its purpose, time, people, and place, one start to see that actually much of its success can be contributed to collaborative governance, from village communities to local district governments to the city government, and collaboration with central. There's a cultural continuity through the villages and the means of production. It's very much, you know, it very much has inclusive societies. You have, you know, very well-trained PhD students from top schools living next door to migrant workers from a village, and they're all kind of in it together to a certain extent, and not by choice perhaps, but that is what makes Shenzhen quite interesting. Flexible planning. Shenzhen's master plans has been changed every single 3 to 4 years because the city's growth has always outpaced its urban planning by actually 10 to 20 to 30 fold. We're not talking about just exceeded by 10%. Rather than kind of this planned economy, Shenzhen very much thrived on an informal economy that has contributed to its formal economy as well. And rather than speaking about Shenzhen only as an urban production, I think it's really important to understand that in China, almost whether you're talking about villages or cities, that we should be looking at it as a rural-urban continuum. And it is that continuum that is the source of tension, but I think also the source of new ways to think about cities that could be very, very productive when we're speaking about what can be learned from this rapid pace of urbanization in China in the past 40 years, not only in Shenzhen, but in many sites in China. So I would stop right there, and I look forward to Tian's discussion, Tian's lecture, and then we can have a discussion, the questions.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation of some of the most common misconceptions about Shenzhen city. This is a book that I also really enjoyed reading because of the way it combines personal stories with a larger picture of politics and economics in a very good way.
Thank you.
So before we go to any questions, I want to introduce our second presenter, who is Dr. Kien van Lim. He is an economic geographer and senior lecturer at the University of Newcastle. And his main research interests revolves around policy experimentations in city regions, a topic that he has published widely on, among other things, the book that he is going to discuss today, which is called On Shifting Foundations. His research examines how industrial and local policies of particular city regions generate new development directions on a national level or a national scale. So Kien joined the Center for Urban and Regional Development Studies at Newcastle University in the spring of 2018. And before that, he was assistant professor at the University of Nottingham. So please, Kien, we are looking forward to your presentation.
Yep, so a very good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to the presentation. And thanks first and foremost to Heidi for the kind invitation to join this fantastic platform. You know, I think I was mentioning informally earlier, it was fantastic to be able to have a conversation with one of the top experts on Shenzhen, and also to have discussion on issues pertaining to city regional development in China more broadly. And thanks very much to Steve for the kind introduction. And I really enjoyed Jen's presentation, and hopefully, you know, these will build on and complement what has been presented so far. I also really enjoyed the book, which I read 2 months ago, over the past 2 months, and you know, yeah, it is a really fantastic way to set up the multiple layers of Shenzhen's history, and I think this really fascinates me because the background to which I approached Shenzhen was from the outside. So you know, I didn't have any prior conception of what Shenzhen was like or its history when I first started to think about Shenzhen. And I think with reference to the very interesting video that Jen showed in her presentation, I think you know, it's an apt way to make a reference, because when I first approached Shenzhen as a case, it was because someone drew a circle in you know, in a particular location, and that was an even smaller circle than what Deng did you know, about 40 years ago. So that was a circle that's not very far away from Nantou Historic City, and that is in a location that looks like this. So when I went to Shenzhen in 2013, I went to this location known as Qianhai Bay. So it is a location that is not far away from what we saw earlier about Nantou Historic City. Is on the western side of Shenzhen. And I went there for a specific reason. And that was because that area was recently designated as a nationally strategic developmental zone. So but when I went there, this was what I saw. All right, this is a you know, a relatively empty plot of land, and development was just starting. But the underlying basis of this designation was made very clear in this photograph that I took here, and that is the aim. I mean, I hope my translation is it comes as close to the intended meaning, but you know, the aim is to continue to be courageous in surpassing and you know, to achieve distinction. So these forms the basis of the title of my presentation today, and that is becoming more special than special. So the aim is to create another zone, to draw the drawing of this circle is to create another special zone within what is already a special zone. And the motto then was to try to achieve this. And when I went, they were just starting to, you know, start construction on the site, but the area was already drawn up and policies were already implemented and were in place. And the underlying basis for my investigation was more on the politics, on the formation of this area. But over the course of the past 8 years, we have seen quite dramatic transformation in the area. So if we see here, I mean, we see an empty plot of land that is relatively brown looking. I mean, if we have a look at how things have changed over the past few years, it really reflects what was mentioned earlier in the presentation as a Shenzhen speed. So let's have a look. So on the left, that was the little circle that was drawn. It was only about a size of 15 square kilometers in Qianhai Bay. All right, and that was where I stood when I arrived in 2013. Nothing much have changed from the photograph on the left, and it was a relatively empty plot of land. But to your right, this is how Qianhai looks today. So it has become relatively more built up, and a bridge has been constructed, and it is the highway that links Shenzhen to Guangzhou. So there is significant development in terms of its real estate. So that area has been transformed as a result of this drawing of a circle, if we like, and the designation of a nationally strategic status. And the cross section here looks like this. All right, so right in the foreground, not too far away, was where I stood, and today Qianhai is a relatively developed zone. I mean, and it is still in the midst of being developed, and it is a designated financial zone and a zone that connects Hong Kong firms. Now, this sets the introduction to this area that I was looking at, and my angle was slightly different, but I think we arrived at relatively similar conclusions. When I went there, I was looking at why this area of Shenzhen was chosen, and in so doing, all right, I uncovered a series of historical and geographic logics that I didn't expect before. So let me start with the benefit of hindsight with the historic logic that I realized over the past 8 years. So in celebrating Shenzhen's 40 years, one of the mainstream national media in China heralded the development of the so-called Qianhai model. And a very interesting phrase, and the way that it has been presented is Shenzhen at 40, it represents the most beautiful and best picture can be drawn on a piece of blank paper, and why the Qianhai model works. Now, what I'm interested in here is the presentation of the creation of this particular plot of land, Qianhai New Area, as the basis of a most beautiful piece of paper, a drawing that that was drawn on a piece of blank paper. And in the preceding presentation, we understand that this definitely is not the case. All right, it represents what we can see very shortly as the continuation of what we Juan has mentioned as the Shenzhen myth, if you like, because there are specific histories to this plot of land. But the mainstream national media, very recently in 2020, continues to represent the development of such a plot of land as something really radically new, as if there was no history on that plot of land prior. And there is a history to this, and I can trace these to, I think for those very familiar with the history of New China, so to speak, this shouldn't be too much of a surprise, because it's a very commonly used phrase in China after it was first introduced in this journal known as the Red Flag, or Hongqi, right, in 1958, in an article by no other, the person Mao Zedong, who wrote at the time that here we have China at the time represented a piece of blank paper that has no burden, on which can be written the most beautiful and newest words, on which can be drawn the newest and most beautiful picture. So over here, we can see that there is a specific emphasis and there's a particular preference, if we like, to create something new from nothing. And this represents maybe not a universal approach, but a relatively preferred approach to new developments, right? With the aim, hopefully, to blanket over aspects of history that maybe either should not be referred to or are not relevant, but that there is a particular logic and preference for creating developments on the basis of something that is blank, right? So a blank canvas preference, if we like. But this is not the case. So in Jen's book, which I really enjoyed, as I mentioned earlier, all right, there is the notion of the Shenzhen myth, and I think this is a critical intervention in the literature because it really provides, an angle from which to look at Shenzhen's history and the fact that there is a constitutive aspect to the city's history in its development. So the myth, refers to the fact that there's an instant city that rose from nothingness. And it does appear from the media report that Qianhai also rose from nothingness. But that definitely wasn't the case. And I can elaborate later on the specific histories regarding that plot of land and the broader political issues that underpinned its formation. So here, I think an alternative angle which I draw from this book from Jen is that the placeness of Shenzhen is critical here for us to understand this formation, and I think it adds another layer to my understanding of Qianhai New Area and allows me to speak about it and from this angle in that Shenzhen is a unique place and it has a variety of specific features that contributed to its growth, and I am going to talk about a few of these specific features, right, that makes Qianhai a special zone in itself, and as in why it is regarded as something strategic. And this has specific implications on the replicability of this area and its trajectory for other places. So 30 years on, in 2009, the special nature of the special economic zone has become a unique feature. So that was my starting point. All right, so politicians and leaders within China sought to make use of Shenzhen's special status, all right, as a basis for their development, for their political ambitions, and in so doing, they pushed for the designation of a small plot of land near Qianhai Bay to become a nationally strategic new area. All right, but there are a lot of contextual issues that underpinned this formation, and there were a lot of difficulties with regard to how this could be done. But in 2009, all right, Shenzhen has evolved to the degree that a lot of political figures sought to build on the special economic zones development over the past 30 years as the basis for further growth. And because the special economic zone was already special, all right, the only way that it can be done and that further distinction could be added to Shenzhen was to make sure that it becomes more special. And to do so, there was a strong political push for nationally strategic status. So before long, there were repeated attempts to get Qianhai to be designated as such a zone without much success, but eventually it was designated as a special zone within the special zone and became once again a national focal point, where something special and something unique is going to take place. And this has been framed as a special zone in itself within what is already unique. So we are going to find out what exactly is unique about Qianhai. So basically, from my angle, the main contextual feature of these location, all right, is its proximity to Hong Kong. And at the time, there was, I think this preceded the formation of the strategy for the Greater Bay Area. So at the time, the program was called the integration of Macau and Hong Kong within the Pearl River Delta. So there was a strategy to further integrate Macau and Hong Kong within the regional economy of the region. And Qianhai was positioned in such a way that could facilitate these integration. So here we are looking specifically at Shenzhen's geographical uniqueness and its proximity to Hong Kong. Once again, in a way, we can say that history repeated itself 30 years later, but in a different geographical dimension. But still, the proximity to Hong Kong was the underlying basis for the designation of this location. And this wasn't previously successful because there was no such integration planned at the national level. But once that plan was set, Qianhai received attention together with another zone in Zhuhai City. So for Qianhai's uniqueness and the special aspect to it lies in this particular feature called the wholly foreign-owned entity that has 5 features that I'll very quickly run through. First, it has total legality in China. So once you are set up as a firm in this zone, you are recognized as a Chinese firm, as a Chinese individual, if you like, and therefore you can function within China as a Chinese firm. Yet you have the ability to invoice in the RMB, and this underpins another national strategy to internationalize the flow of RMB, and flows of RMB between Qianhai and Hong Kong are relatively free. So firms within Qianhai would be able to invoice and conduct trade and borrow money in the RMB in relation to banks and firms based in Hong Kong. And very interestingly, they can legally hire both foreign and local staff. So there are way less restrictions on the hiring of foreign staff, and if I remember correctly, the income tax levels are also different from the rest of the country. All right, so the other few points are more standardized across China now. That is the ability to export products and repatriate profits, IP protection, no oversight needed from Chinese organizations. So there are a few specific features that are really unique to this territory, and the RMB internationalization and the hiring of foreign staff would be the key features. And it is very clear that the orientation is towards Hong Kong without it being explicitly stated legally, because the requirement for setting up this entity in Qianhai is that you need to put in 770,000 US dollars into the capital account. But if you are already a firm registered in Hong Kong, the investing firm, this amount is waived. So needless to say, without stating the obvious, it would actually make sense for you to have a firm registered in Hong Kong and then invest in Qianhai New Area. So the main aim was to integrate and to bring firms based in Hong Kong into China, and to in other words, create a mini free zone within China by linking up with firms in Hong Kong. All right, so at the moment, more than 10,000 firms have already invested in this area. Now, of more relevance to our broader discussion today is Qianhai's special status unique to place? And I think it is quite clear that to a large extent, the geographical proximity to Hong Kong, all right, is fundamental to Qianhai and Shenzhen's special status. And in this regard, the link to Hong Kong is key. Yet, I think to understand the designation of this territory, we need to consider 2 scales. One is the national level, the national scale, and the other would be the local scale, which was something that was emphasized in Jen's presentation previously. But here, the politics that is involved, has to incorporate the national scale, and we need to understand being special is an outcome of the combination of what Susan Shirk calls reciprocal accountability, which remains to this day a relevant concept for understanding the Chinese political system and the process of state rescaling introduced by Neil Brenner. So reciprocal accountability in summary refers to the delegation of power, all right, the willingness of the central government to delegate power to local governments, but the expectation is that local governments reciprocate by aligning their policies and their developmental plans to the national strategy. All right, so there is a need for these, and local politicians are always very keen to introduce new ideas, but on the basis that it links back to the broader, and it can support the national strategy. So herein lies the process of state rescaling, where the central government is willing to rescale its functions to specific territories at various scales. So it no longer operates a centralized top-down approach to development, but it actually encourages the rescaling of the national territory into different differentiated regulatory parts. So what we have here is a very interesting situation where the central government created a system that encourages local officials to constantly look to Beijing. All right, so in local parlance, it is to Pao Beijing, right? Just whenever you would like to have special policies, all right, which is again a very commonly used term in in local parlance is 要政策. You have to go to Beijing, and in that sense, it rescales regulatory relations on the basis of territorial differentiation. All right, the new circle that is drawn, in the western part of Shenzhen, and in our context here with regard to Shenzhen, and it simultaneously allows the central government to retain its power, because when new policies are needed, you need to come to me in order for me to grant you the power. So here we have a situation where both decentralization and centralization works in tandem. So with that background, and looking at Qianhai, the formation of Qianhai New Area from that particular vantage point, we would ask a question that aligns back to the theme of today's presentation, and that is whether Shenzhen can be a developmental model. So what aspects of Shenzhen's evolution can be duplicated and disseminated? Well, this is a commonly used term in China, and there is a 复制 and 推广. So in our case here, with regard to Qianhai New Area, we have seen that from the nationals, Qianhai and Shenzhen is still embedded within the Chinese political system, which is hierarchical, which is regularly, which is rescaled, and in terms of national regulation, there is territorial differentiation. So Shenzhen is positioned within this, and local politicians, by local I mean provincial and city officials, are keen to build into and feed back into this system. So many have tried but weren't successful. But 10 years ago, the governor, who is now one of the top leaders in China, the previous governor was Wang Yang, so he was successful in getting Qianhai designated as a national new area, but this involves politics. Yet, how would the special aspects of Qianhai New Area and Shenzhen more broadly be connected and enabled by the placeness of the city? Right, I wasn't able to mention this point earlier, but after Qianhai was designated as a nationally strategic new area, although it was a blank piece of land, as we saw at the beginning of my presentation, all right, my understanding was the first 5 years were particularly difficult because a variety of individuals and firms own the land, and those were linked to the state in one way or another. So there were in local parlance known as historical problems, legacies of history, if we like. So so there were a lot of place-related barriers, all right, that prevented Qianhai from being developed very quickly. But at the moment, it does appear, and this is something that we may have to research further, these barriers seem to have been cleared gradually, and now it's fulfilling its intended function as a nationally strategic zone that allows further integration with the Hong Kong economy. So I will end with this question, and hopefully we can have an interesting discussion, and that is whether Shenzhen can truly be a model for development when its leaders are constantly trying to enhance its special status. Or we can put it the other way, is the very quest to be special, so to try to continue to distinguish the city's unique status and position at a variety of scale, this very quest to be special and to want to continue to improve and stay ahead, is this quest the most duplicable aspect of Shenzhen's evolution? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, throwing more light on the current uses of special economic regions in China. And I think you ended on in a very good way with a direct question, and I wanted to let Jen give her a chance to respond to your question at the end of your presentation. Jen, do you have any thoughts?
I think Ian asked a few interesting questions. So maybe you could re-articulate the question that you think is most urgent or most worthy of our discussion right now.
I think the most easiest would be if Keen, could you please put your last slide back up on the screen, and then we have it in front of us. Thank you.
Yeah, there we go.
So I was thinking about the last question on this slide.
The last one, can Shenzhen truly be a model? Is that the question? Yes. Okay, all right. You know, I think I do have a section in my book that talks about, it has a title, what is so special about Shenzhen? What is so special about the special economic zone? And believe it or not, this question has been asked ever since the first year the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone was formed. And it was very often asked with a great deal of anxiety. Which is that as the policies that were tested, you know, that were first rolled out, initiated in Shenzhen, as it became accepted by Beijing as something that is safe and actually could bring about positive change without unsettling political and other type of social structures, it became to be rolled out all over China, right? And then there was a lot of anxiety in Shenzhen and about Shenzhen to say, well, once these policies that's been established and experimented with and formulated in the special economic zone, once it's been duplicated and disseminated, to use Kian's translation, all over China, what's so special about Shenzhen then? So Shenzhen has been declared to have not necessarily died, but basically Shenzhen has been declared that it was no longer special numerous times throughout the past 40 years. You know, it's from the first decade, you know, 90s, it was already no longer special. 2000s was no longer special. You know, 2005, what's so special? You know, it seems like all of the policies from hukou to business to, you know, financials, and it's all over China. So what could be special? Certainly, you know, the economic growth is no longer going to be, but yet Shenzhen continuously has exceeded all planned and policyed growth. So I think there is something very special about Shenzhen, and I think that it's not just in the policy. And if we're only looking at especially economic policy as a way to duplicate and disseminate Shenzhen, it will fail. Because, you know, the special economic zone, the policies of special economic zone that came out of Shenzhen have been constantly duplicated, disseminated to Zhuhai, to what is it? To Xinjiang even, yeah, say from Zhuhai, very close to the PRD, all the way to Xinjiang, the Kashgar Special Economic Zone was the latest one. And then there were hundreds in between. And now there are tens of thousands special economic zones in the world. If you were to really look at their policies, they're quite similar. Yet, there isn't any special economic zone, neither in China nor anywhere else, that comes close to what is Shenzhen today. So I really think it shouldn't take scientists and policymakers nor geniuses to understand the question has been asked wrong, right? That it's not what policies of Shenzhen can be duplicated and disseminated, is to ask what is so unique about its people, what's so unique about its culture, what's so unique about things that's not seemingly visible? What is so unique about things that couldn't be encapsulated through data and policies? Because if it was so easy, it's been 40 years, right? So, you know, so that it's part of the reason why, Siv, you mentioned that my book, one thing I have tried to emphasize is to have each chapter to be rooted on personal narratives, not my personal narrative, thank goodness, but other people's personal narratives throughout the history of Shenzhen, individuals, you know, from villagers to policymakers, you know, from mayors to developers who were a migrant that slept on the street the first night he was in Shenzhen. Because I actually believe that something that has been overlooked is the humanity of the Chinese city. And I would go far to say that today we are overlooking the humanities of all cities because we are reducing them to numbers and data and GDP and policies. And for me, what has been very remarkable of my study of Shenzhen and then writing about it is that I actually added I would say, you know, I said the book took me 15 years. The personal narratives I integrated in the book probably in the last 2-3 years of it, because I felt that it was just so complex and I needed in some ways a guide to really allow people who's not familiar with Shenzhen, who's not interested in policies nor economics, to still be interested in this city they probably have never seen and in a culture that might be very difficult for them to connect. So for me is that I think, you know, I don't think there can ever be another Shenzhen, full stop, because Shenzhen's developmental history was really happened not only at a very unique moment in Chinese history, it happened within a very unique moment of global history. So it's very difficult to say, to duplicate something that had such transnational, you know, it was very much impacted by transnational currents and changes and dynamics. And it impacted transnational relationships as well. So, you know, and that's on top of what I've trying to say was my short kind of squeezing 15 years into 20 minutes, is that, you know, there is also this very deep history that it's just really, really fascinating. And, you know, so I want to say that I don't think there can be another Shenzhen. And I think it's foolish to ask that question because, I mean, will we say, can there be another Paris? Will we say, can there be another New York? do we assume we can copy London? I mean, I really think, you know, that this way of thinking is, you know, we should just move beyond it. So just because Shenzhen, there cannot be another Shenzhen, it doesn't mean there are not aspects and you know, I don't want to say lessons, but it doesn't mean there aren't knowledge and intelligence that we cannot learn. I absolutely think we can, and I actually think we're just starting to. I mean, this is a city that went from 300,000 people to 20 million in a few decades. It has never happened on Earth before. What makes us think any of us could dissect and understand and pretend we know exactly what contributed to its success? It's something that's never happened on a scale, a rate, a pace that has never happened. So I actually think that for me, even, you know, after I'm actually a little bit intimidated, and when Kian said I'm the expert on Shenzhen, I think I'm a student of Shenzhen. Like, I've learned a lot from studying the city, speaking with the people, and trying to kind of recompose different arguments together. So I think Shenzhen, we can and we should study Shenzhen much more carefully and in a nuanced way. But I'm not sure this idea of duplicating it or it being a model is necessarily the right direction for cities and economies and individuals who wish to learn from its success.
Thank you. And listening to your answer and that there can never be another Shenzhen, I wanted to ask Kian, because we're talking about Qianhai, the Qianhai model, yes, and the new area, and do you think if there were no Shenzhen, would this new area have been developed in the way that it is being developed now, or what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think it actually depends on the context, and I probably will speak from what I know, you know, concretely with regard to the formation of these new area. Or I mean, it's not too new now, given that, you know, there are new territories that have emerged. But I think I'll speak from my perspective, my understanding of what happened in the build-up to the designation of these area, and the issue is not whether there is Shenzhen or not. I mean, so I operated on the premise that there was Shenzhen, and my understanding was previous leaders actually tried to and they had their eyes already set on the Qianhai Bay, because I think, you know, there remains some land that was relatively untouched within a fast urbanizing landscape that could be utilized, but it just didn't align to the national, to something that could be considered nationally important. So even with Shenzhen, you know, previous leaders have failed. So I spoke to someone who told me that it wasn't easy to get the policymakers in Beijing to grant these status and to give them autonomy to craft policies that, you know, could be then implemented in this location in Shenzhen. So obviously we do not know how Wang Yang and his colleagues persuaded the colleagues in Beijing to grant this decision. I mean, but presumably the usual lobbying process would have taken place, and you know, these led to eventually to the formation, not just with Qianhai new area, but at a time very quickly, within the space of 3 to 4 years, the central government actually designated 3 zones at 3 points in the Pearl River Delta. So the Hengqin new area across the delta was actually first, and then Qianhai, and then ultimately Nansha new area, just slightly north of Qianhai new area. So we form a triangle of newly designated territories for experimentation. So now to the hypothetical question is, if there is no Shenzhen, will there be a Qianhai? I think I can reasonably answer this question on the basis of my understanding of the reciprocal accountability system, and that is yes. actually a lot of local governments around China now are clamoring the central government for special policies. So the idea of the Yao Zhengce is actually quite universal across China, in the sense that there's a lot of active lobbying to try to cultivate positive relations, so that, you know, there is a possibility that, you know, my territory will be recognized as the new Shenzhen, so to speak. So effectively,
Yes.
this is a very dialectical process that I call decentralization and centralization, because it is a way for the central government to reinforce its power, but yet it allows local development and local initiatives to come through, and then they are evaluated. So in this sense, hypothetically, yes. So with regard to the Shenzhen case, but you know, we are now you know, trying to look at which other new areas are being designated, and the question is, after they are designated in the short term, you know, the usual critical way to look at it will be there will be fast real estate development. So the question in the longer term will be whether it just remains real estate development, or whether it generates something really positive for the region. And yet, you know, if it generates something really positive, it could be on the premise that it is special, just like I think Xian'an New Area is special in its own way. Then to what extent then can these new area, the new policies be replicable and then re-exported in another location? So I hope this answers that question from
Yes,
both the
yes,
historical point
thank
of view
you.
and as well as the, you know, the more macro hypothetical angle.
Yes, thanks. I wanted to also include a question from one of our viewers. It's a question for Jian. From Dr. Carlos Soto at the University of Hong Kong. He says that he's curious about Jian's idea that Shenzhen is designed to provide a good life, not only generate wealth. And he wonders what lessons Hong Kong can draw from Shenzhen, including its mission and planning practices.
Well, thank you first for that question, and I also want to mark that it's quite remarkable that now we're asking what could Hong Kong learn from Shenzhen, because, you know, for decades it's about Shenzhen learning from Hong Kong. And for me, is that I would answer in a way to say that what I wrote about the history and this kind of cultural, this regional cultural history of Shenzhen is actually very much shared by Hong Kong. That prior to British colonialization of Hong Kong, the villages of this whole territory, they shared a common, very much common agricultural and familiar, even literary, educational history. So, you know, I very much see Shenzhen and Hong Kong as mutually supportive, and has been for centuries, not only in the past 40 years. And while I didn't write the Shenzhen experiment from the perspective, as a lot of previous literature, from the perspective of what Shenzhen learned from Hong Kong, you know, Hong Kong is very much present in my book. I think I did a word count that it appeared something like 265 times in the book. So this is the way to get back to this question as raised, of what could Hong Kong learn from Shenzhen about increasing its quality of life. It's a difficult question to answer for me, because I consider myself both a Shenzhener and a Hong Konger, even though I'm from neither of these places. I have very deep passion and care for these two cities and their communities. I would say first and foremost, a courage to experiment, and courage to not fear of making policy mistakes. So having worked on both sides, both in Shenzhen and in Hong Kong, on multiple projects, cultural projects, educational projects, planning projects, and working with government agencies and individuals on both sides, because Shenzhen it has this particular spirit that is very much said, you know, very experimental. It's like, let's try this, you know, let's try to see if it will work. If it doesn't work, we'll change it next year. You know, that was one of the first things that was struck me when I first started doing field work in Shenzhen 15 years ago, is that there was a large degree of openness and humbleness of its policymakers. And this is from the mayor all the way down. And it was very much as like, well, we actually don't know. What do you think? Whereas, you know, Hong Kong's governance, whether, you know, we're talking about prior to 1997 and post 1997, the way it's been set up, and here, you know, where I'm speaking to two individuals very embedded with the British educational system and cultures, I blame it on post-colonial culture, is that there is a post-colonial legacy of governance and policy is something that has been really solid and very correct and very permanent. And it's there. Don't question it. It's better for you. Take it. Where, you know, so I would say, you know, I said Shenzhen has learned so much in terms of its policy system, legal system, financial system, contract commerce from Hong Kong. So if you were to ask me what is one thing that we, not only Hong Kong, but actually governments from all over the world, we're going to learn from this about, you know, relationship and policy and the quality of everyday life, is that there is a great deal of constant kind of try and error. You know, this works, let's do it. This doesn't work, let's try something else. And that we would often, perhaps one might say this is a sign of failure of leadership, but we will often see that, you know, policies gets rolled out and 5 years later, it's totally the opposite direction. And then 5 years later, it goes somewhere else again. But very often these policy reversals, at least from my study of the first, say, 30 years of Shenzhen, or 35 years of Shenzhen, very often those policy reversals or policy direction changes is actually from listening of people, you know, not through votes perhaps, but what's in the press, what are experts saying, what are, you know, the different communities saying, what's the headline of the popular media, what are they saying? So I take one example, Shenzhen's urban villages. In 2005, when I started studying Shenzhen, the mayor's policy on urban villages was to demolish it all in 5 years. That was his goal. Fast forward to last year, almost 15 years later, the policy from the mayor's office through the planning bureau and the planning bureau is do not demolish. Instead, you know, those are located in the city center to just, it's called integrated renovation, is to improve the quality of the infrastructure of the buildings. Don't demolish them. This is a total policy reversal within a decade. I don't think we have seen that in many other cities, city governance in the history of, say, cities. So this is very much something that I think I personally find that it's been a delight to be able to understand that actually all of the efforts that as individuals, whether through scholarship, through activism, through exhibitions, through symposium, through speaking to popular press, etc., is that we actually have been able to change the public's opinion of that urban village is not only dirty and grimy and we should get rid of them, that they're really important as places for people to live. They're very important for the economic sustainability of the city. So, you know, all of that happened and then the policy follows suit. So it's very much something I think that might be surprising for people who's not familiar with this particular aspect of Shenzhen, to hear that there could be such a responsiveness of, you know, city policy to a cultural change in the city that happened in the time of 1 decade. And I'm not sure if we have really seen that in Hong Kong, say in the past 30 years.
Thank you very much. I also want to go straight another question from one of our viewers. For both of you, perhaps Keen would like to answer it first, and then Jen can answer up. From Joyce Brown, Honduras. And she asks, was Shenzhen different from the other special economic zones of 1980 in the number of villages that retained ownership of their historic land? And I might also add, for the new areas that you have studied, Keen, is there a difference there?
I'm not too sure about the pre-existing villages that, or rather the villages that pre-existed before the Qianhai was fully flattened, if you like, and and was redeveloped. But I suspect that if maybe Jen can elaborate on this a little on the title rights of urban villages. But from my understanding from conversations with a good friend of mine who worked on urban villages in Wuhan city is that these urban villages remain rural residential sites. They are considered rural residences. So I'm not sure if I answered this correctly, Jen. In terms of the title rights, they are considered rural. They are considered rural. Rural residences, but they are physically in the city.
That was the case at first.
Yes.
So in the first 2 decades of Shenzhen, all of the urban villages and the villagers themselves were considered rural hukou holders, yes. And their land, the urban village sites, were considered urban. However, there were policy change where they urbanized the villagers, but they also urbanized the land. So it means through policy, the land no longer belonged to the villagers, very conveniently. So, and that happened twice in Shenzhen. First, for all of the villages and villagers in the special economic zone. And then that was in 1990s, and then later in the 2000s, all villages in Shenzhen, all urban villages in Shenzhen became urbanized. So on the surface, the villagers became, having urban hukou, but they also lost their land. Right, they still had property right to the building they built, the urban village building, but they lost right to those land. And for me, that is not learning from the history of Shenzhen, because these groups of people had a certain ownership, both legally and emotionally and culturally over their land, that they were, they borrowed money from their relatives. Some of them are in Shenzhen, some of them are in other parts in China, some of them are in Singapore. And they each built this kind of rental home. And this like singularly almost handmade buildings became the predominant form of housing in the city. So, had these villagers and villages not retained in the early decades of Shenzhen ownership over those parts of land which they built these urban village buildings that became affordable housing, essentially, I don't think Shenzhen would have been able to develop so quickly and so well, because where would these thousands of people arriving on a daily basis, where would they live? There, because again, I spoke about the speed and rate of increase of the population in Shenzhen, is that it's kind of, you had thousands of self-entrepreneurial individual building rental housing for migrant populations. That's why it was able to absorb so quickly all of these kind of massive migrant people coming in. If you compare, even though the buildings are substandard, and even though there are infrastructural and hygiene issues of the urban villages, but if you compare their quality of life, if you compare people who live in urban villages in Shenzhen versus those who live in the dormitories built by factories, such as Foxconn, who built all the iPhone parts, right? We had a whole series of suicides, bullying, severe depression. It's incomparable, right? So if these urban villages and the villagers didn't have ownership over the land, if they didn't build these housing, we would be looking at predominantly factory-built massive dormitories. Could they have families? Could they integrate? Could they form small businesses, noodle shops, you know, that supports a whole city and the economy? I think we would have seen a very different history of Shenzhen, and I don't actually think we would be talking about its success today if that was the case.
Thank you. Yeah, we are unfortunately soon running out of time, so I wanted to ask a last quick question from both of you. Perhaps of you first, Keen. When President Xi Jinping visited Shenzhen in October last year, he held a speech and gave several new policies and a lot of optimism about Shenzhen's future role. How do you see Shenzhen in the future? Do you think it will follow the same path, or do you think there is a different future for Shenzhen?
From the way I look at it, and maybe this is a little more regional and macro, and not within the place specificities within Shenzhen itself, but you know, from more broadly in the region, I think Shenzhen plays a very important role in the integration of what is now known as the Greater Bay Area. And I think geopolitically, with the change in Hong Kong's status, I'm not sure whether there might be an acceleration of the integration of the Hong Kong economy within this Greater Bay Area to create more resilience to the Hong Kong economy. In the event that the US does not reverse its recognition, I mean, you know, it's a changed recognition of Hong Kong. So in that sense, Shenzhen, I think, will have a very important intermittent role to play in integrating with the Hong Kong economy.
What do you think, Jen?
I think we place, in general, too much hope and responsibility on leaders, both in China and in Europe and in the United States. I do attribute Deng Xiaoping to have been very, very instrumental to supporting the establishment of Shenzhen as a city and as a special economic zone, and to continue support it when he, in his lifetime. However, I really do attribute Shenzhen's success more so to the people of Shenzhen. You know, and that is from, again, you know, the different mayors, the different university presidents and teachers, to all the migrant workers who are there. And I believe that, you know, maybe this is too idealistic of me, but I would say that if my examination of how Shenzhen has evolved in the past 40 years, but also in the past centuries, is that I do believe there is so much there that lives in each individual citizen of the city still, that it will continue to evolve and generate new stories and generate unexpected successes and perhaps failures. And I think that in general, all cities thrive when there is supportive governance from, you know, centralized organizations. In Shenzhen's case, Shenzhen really benefited from having quite a lot of freedom to explore their own policies and formulate their own places. And I do think for Xi Jinping now having placed Shenzhen now as a new model going forward, whether it's for the Greater Bay Area or for China, you know, I think it's in some ways it's double-edged. On one hand, it's elevating Shenzhen to a very, very important location in kind of Chinese history and in the national and international attention. On the other hand, there's now a lot of pressure placed on the local government of we cannot make mistakes. And I would say that is a departure. You know, from my experience of working in the city for the past few years, there now is, compared to before, there is now more of a, you know, I said earlier when I answered that question, I said I really appreciated that Shenzhen's policymakers really had a very, you know, had a courage and experimental mindset, like let's try this, doesn't work, we try something else. But now suddenly, because of all these national attention that it must succeed, it cannot fail, that now I do feel like that has placed so much pressure on all of the leaders and policymakers. And for me, that's actually a little bit worrisome because, you know, I do believe the city has benefited from being able to kind of be a little bit messy and try different things. And now it's like, oh, we cannot make a single mistake. And that is a version of Shenzhen I'm actually not used to, that I'm still trying to get used to. I'm still trying to get used to, you know, having to be very careful with my words when I'm meeting with a city official, not for my benefit, but for that person's benefit. You know, I don't want that person to get in trouble. So, and that's very much something new, is that now there's a lot more cautions in the city. Of wanting to do what is correct and really not wanting to fail this great project and direction. So you know, that is to be seen then how much would this kind of conservative turn, in some ways, this conservative turn, a mindset that's kind of global as well, I think. But you know, back to Shenzhen, I think it remains to be seen how much this conservative turn of policymakers in Shenzhen of just being much more cautious than before and not wanting mistakes, not wanting to do anything that might unsettle the stability of how things are. I think it remains to be seen what does that do to its economics? What does that do to its businesses? You know, I said before, I think we place too much importance on policies and such, because I actually do think what's really unique about Shenzhen is a particular mindset that percolates throughout the society of saying, let's just try it. Let's, you know, and so I for me is that I obviously am vested for the city to succeed, and I really do hope that the city, the individuals, again, from policymakers to individuals studying in schools, you know, continue in some ways that spirit of experimentation and that spirit of just openness to the world and to new ideas and new modes of work. And I think that is what has allowed the city to somehow became very futuristic through its tech sector, through its digital sector and such. I don't think that it's for me, that is very much related as much to technology as it is to mindset.
Yes. So the future might not hold as many surprises as the last 40 years, but there might be surprises in the development of Shenzhen in the next 40 years. Well, we have unfortunately run out of time, so I would like to give a big thank you to both of our presenters today, Kin Fan Lim and Yuan Du, for sharing your knowledge on the current status of the special economic zone of Shenzhen. And thank you also to our that joined us today and those who sent in questions. We will forward those questions that we didn't have time to read to the presenters so that they can have a look at what people were interested in after listening to their presentations. And yes, there will be a new seminar in this series in exactly 1 month. So we wish you all welcome back on the 3rd of March. And you can find the full program if you check it if you look at brokex.org. There's the full program of all of the seminars in this series. So again, thank you so much to Jiandu and for your excellent presentations today. And with that, we end today's seminar.
Yep, thank you very much. Yeah, we hope to keep in touch.
Thank you.
I know.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.